set. Good morning. I'm John Walters, Chief Operating Officer of Hudson Institute. Welcome to Hudson's Betsy and Wally Stern Policy Center. Welcome too to those joining us on C-SPAN and online. Founded in 1961, Hudson Institute is a leading voice in Washington and capitals around the world, promoting democracy, American leadership in partnership with our allies for a secure, free, and prosperous future. Our thanks publicly, I want to make these to our many friends and supporters who allow this work to go on. We hope you can join us for some of our future programs, including July 13th, when Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates will be at Hudson to discuss U.S. intelligence community transformation efforts and the possible impact of Russian cyber influence on the U.S. midterm elections in November. We also hope you'll subscribe to our new in-depth podcast, Policy Talk, available now on iTunes and Google Play. We have an important and timely program today. On Sunday, Mexican voters elected Mr. López Obrador, their country's new president, in a landslide. And he and his newly formed party have promised to address the rising violence in Mexico, corruption, and deep inequality. He will be sworn in on December 1st, and among other policy proposals, he has proposed to increase subsidies to those less fortunate in Mexico and review past policy that opened Mexico's energy sector to private investment. While it may come as a surprise to some Americans, Mr. López Obrador did not campaign on issues related to the United States or President Trump, instead focusing on domestic issues. Nonetheless, Mexico and the United States obviously remain deeply intertwined economically and culturally. We are eager to hear the current Mexican ambassador's thoughts on immigration and border security, Nafta, other trade topics, and what Mexicans and their neighbors to the north can expect with the new president. Let me introduce the ambassador from Mexico, His Excellency Gutierrez Fernández. He became Mexico's ambassador in early 2017. He served as managing director for the North American Development Bank, headquartered in San Antonio, Texas, where he focused on infrastructure development and financing along the U.S. Mexico border. Ambassador Gutierrez has had a diverse 15-year career in Mexican federal government, serving in prominent positions in the areas of trade, finance, diplomacy, national security, and did so under 4 presidents. Ambassador Gutierrez holds bachelor degrees in economics and political science and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, for which he received the Fulbright Garcia Robles Scholarship. Walter Russell Mead, who will lead the discussion with the ambassador, is a distinguished fellow here at Hudson Institute, also the James Clark Chance Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College and the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. Walter writes regularly on a wide variety of subjects ranging from international affairs to religion, politics, culture, education, and the media. He is an honors graduate of Groton and Yale. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Gutierrez and Walter Russell Mead.
Thank you, John.
Let me say one other housekeeping thing. You should have cards on your seats which you can jot down questions so that we can do these quickly and smoothly so we get as many in as possible. I know there's a lot of issues. Someone will come along and collect them during the program and pass them to Walter, who will then be able to ask those questions at the end of the program. So use the cards and we'll get everybody in as much as we can. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. I should say the Ambassador has some urgent business to do so. He will need to, when we finish the program, he will need to exit so he can get to the telephone. Apparently this is a day where important calls are being made. But Gerónimo, if I can call you that.
Yes, by all means.
This is a really interesting moment in Mexican history and the history of U.S. Mexican relations. From your perspective, as a longtime participant in Mexican politics and now as ambassador, how do you see things in this transformation now?
Well, first of all, let me thank the Hudson Institute for inviting me to be part of this morning's event. Thank you, John Walters, and it's a pleasure Walter, it's an honor actually to be in this dialogue with you. Yeah, it's certainly a historic moment for Mexico. For many people, Mexico's political transition has taken a long time. Some would argue that it started, in '68 with the student movement. Some would argue that it was started in '97 when, for the first time, we had a divided government. Some would argue that it started in 2000 when President Fox won. I think that the truth is that Mexico's transition has been somewhat ad hoc in the sense that it has taken a long time. And for many, what was pending was having someone left of the aisle win, and that just happened this Sunday. I think the most important thing that I would point out in this respect, with respect to Sunday's election, is the fact that I think it reflects that Mexico is a mature democracy, that we have a strong democratic institutions. I think that there was a very clear result in favor of Mr. López Obrador, one that has been very timely recognized by not only the other competing candidates, but by everybody else. I think that is extremely positive. I think they did so with a very clear sign of statesmanship and patriotism, and I think that's positive. People would have not expected, perhaps a few years ago, that somebody from quote unquote the left would win in Mexico. And it has happened, and it has taken place peacefully. And in spite of the many challenges that we still face as a nation, I think that last Sunday's result is, in that regard, extremely positive. And it has certainly caught the attention of many people abroad, and obviously Mexicans. I'll just very briefly, there's naturally, it's true that campaigns usually take place largely center on domestic issues. I think that was the case in Mexico's past election. But nevertheless, you cannot underestimate the importance of the relationship for Mexico with the United States. I think by and large, the candidates, including Mr. López Obrador, were more or less in the same place with respect to the United States during the campaign. I think that all of them were rather careful. I think they recognized the importance of the relationship. But I did not see in any way an anti-American sentiment within the campaign. And I think that's also positive. I think I'm personally very pleased about the fact that we have, that if I may use this expression, that either gringo bashing was used to gain some political points. I think there's just too much at stake in the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship. As you know, all of you know, Mr. López Obrador has already spoken with President Trump. They have expressed, they had, crossed their first impressions about the relationship. From what I know, that conversation was respectful, constructive, and that's very important, and that's good. And I think that we can expect very soon that the transition team will be in contact both with the Mexican government and with the U.S. government with respect to the U.S. Mexico bilateral agenda. I'll just mention as an introduction, it's no secret that we have three big important tracks in the relationship. One has to deal with trade, one has to deal with security, and the other one with immigration. And I do expect that we can take advantage of what it's a long transition in Mexico, 5 months, to make the most out of this period.
Yep. This transition period of 5 months, should we expect Mexican policy to change gradually during that time, or does it sort of stay on the same course and then there's a change when the new team comes in?
Well, quite frankly, President Peña Nieto is responsible for the governing of Mexico until December the 1st, and he intends to assume fully that responsibility until that time. Yet he has very clearly expressed his willingness and his interest in working with the transition team and Mr. López Obrador as closely as possible in order to address the many challenges that Mexico does have. And I think that's very positive. if you remember, at least, in previous occasions, one of the transition was very much marked by post-electoral debate and complications. This does not seem to be the case right now. As I mentioned, everybody has recognized the result. And I think that allows Mexico to make use of this 5 months, and I think that's positive.
Terrific. I should ask, does the new president-elect of Mexico have a Twitter feed? Can we follow him on
I think he does.
Twitter? Okay. All right, because that may be where the real diplomatic action starts to take place. Now, I think one thing that has surprised some observers in the U.S. is a sense that actually on NAFTA, the new team and the old team don't seem to be that far apart, that there's a lot of continuity in the Nieto position and the Obrador position. Is that?
I would go even a step farther. Just this morning, I read some paper clippings and on the part of Mr. Seade, who's poised to be a chief negotiator on the part of Mr. López Obrador, expressing, at least in general terms, a support to what has been, what Mexico's government has been doing as part of the negotiation, supporting Secretary Guajardo specifically in that respect, who leads the trade negotiation for Mexico. I also saw, I've seen some public expressions on the part of Mr. López Obrador, referring and clearly recognizing the importance of international trade and NAFTA. And also, I think his interest in wrapping up a new NAFTA 2.0 as soon as possible. We, as it has been made very clear, we meaning the Peña Nieto administration, we've been clear about it. We think that it is in the interest of in the best interest of the three countries to wrap up a negotiation on NAFTA 2.0 as soon as possible. I think that all of the countries have other challenges, and it's certainly a very complex geopolitical environment and international trade environment. And I think that the interest of Mexico, the United States, and Canada will be served if we can get to a NAFTA 2.0 that it's on balance acceptable and positive for the three countries. We're not there yet, obviously. As you know, we started formally negotiations in August of last year. We've been, the three parties, been somewhat criticized for the fact that we've been delaying a result. You know, the first time we spoke, we wanted to wrap up by December. That didn't happen. Then we wanted to wrap up by March of this year. That didn't happen. Then there was talk about an agreement in principle in May of this year, and that didn't happen. I wouldn't be too worried about that. These are tough negotiations. Progress has been made, I think, trying to be as objective as possible. There are issues that still remain. As compared to the early 1990s, 91, 92, 93, when NAFTA was negotiated there is far less of a policy alignment this time around among the NAFTA partners. And that makes the negotiation more difficult. But what I do believe, again, going to Mexico, is the fact that Mr. López Obrador has expressed clear interest in proceeding with a new NAFTA, that it's on balance favorable, certainly to Mexico, but to the region as a whole. He has also very clearly mentioned that he understands the importance of foreign investment in Mexico and willingness to work with the private sector, not only in Mexico, but in the United States and elsewhere. And I think that's positive.
Right. What would you say are the main gaps now in the NAFTA position, where the Mexican and U.S. positions are most difficult to reconcile?
Well, there is, on broad terms, I cannot obviously, it would be inappropriate for me to enter into specifics about the negotiation. But there's three big baskets of issues. And one of them, it's no secret that the administration here, President Trump's administration, has expressed his concern about the United States trade deficit. We beg to differ that is the way to measure the success of a trade agreement. We have said that publicly, but nevertheless, we recognize that it is an important item for the U.S. administration. So, and in addressing the deficit, in all candor, the auto sector is extremely important because that's where you find an important part of the trade deficit. I think that there's still, I think we've moved closer to an agreement on how can we modify rules of origin and other provisions with respect to the auto sector that would allow higher regional content on the industry. It's a tough business. The industries are very much involved, but the most important thing is that the auto industry is in fact a North American industry, and therefore what the Mexican position has been is, okay, let's be careful about how do we go about modifying rules of origin or doing anything else. We don't want to shoot ourselves in the feet and then find out that what we ended up doing was sending investment, abroad from North America. So that remains. I think there's progress has been made, and that's certainly one of the important baskets of issues. The other one has to do with the governing of the agreement. The different dispute mechanisms, and that imply, anti-dumping chapters, basically 19, 11, and 20. And there, the sense is that the United States wants to certainly strengthen those mechanisms in a way that nobody's above the U.S. court system. We tend to think that international rules and procedures, as the one we have established, are in fact helpful for international trade. But I think that those are issues that, in my view, should not derail completely the negotiation. I think there's ground to actually update and modernize those provisions in a way that everybody feels satisfied. There is another thing as part of the discussions that I would put within the governing part of the governing basket, which is the so-called sunset clause. It has been publicly talked about, which is this idea about a provision on ending the agreement automatically unless some action is taken. Mexico has been very clear with that respect. We're not in favor of that clause. I expect still a lot of discussions to take place on that regard. We have talked about, it makes sense to have a stronger review of the agreement every so often, every 5 years. But the idea of a sunset clause in itself, certainly it's not something that we believe will be helpful. And our Canadian friends, to my knowledge, seem to be in the same place. And finally, there's another basket which has to deal with labor and environmental standards. On environment, when we did NAFTA 25 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. First of all, the environment was not as front and center as it is today. I think that the three sides believe that we can strengthen the provisions on the environment that were inside agreements previously, and that now would come as part of the formal agreement. And I think that there's basically a good consensus on what needs to be achieved. And on labor standards, the concern is that we must have, as a region, better labor standards, but specifically Mexico. The truth is that Mexico is in favor of having better labor standards. We've had serious discussions about that. There was a reform that was pushed by President Peña Nieto in 2013-14 at the constitutional level. And now there's a secondary legislation that needs to pass that will strengthen labor standards, that will provide for more transparent elections of unions and procedures within unions. We don't oppose that basic principle. And I think that, in my view, that is an area where you will find the next administration willing to work. And I think that we will probably get to an agreement on that. So those are the three baskets. We can expect that nobody's going to be, in my view, that nobody's going to be perfectly happy with the end result. It takes compromise to reach an agreement like this. It's likely that each party will gain some, will lose some. The important point is that in balance, we strongly believe that a new NAFTA 2.0 is fundamental for the competitiveness of the region as a whole, certainly for Mexico, and that it is actually, and appropriately modernized, is the right tool that would keep the North American region competitive. That is the central argument we have been making. I think that there are many people in the United States that believe in, either from Congress, from governors, the private sector, that believe this is the right approach.
Okay. I know anytime there's a political transition, there can be uncertainty, and this can play out in financial markets. And there's been some speculation that with at least some of the more left-wing things that were said during the campaign, you combine that with generally nervousness in emerging markets, with rising interest rates in Europe and the U.S., and then you add on to that some of the concern about NAFTA, the shadow of the future of NAFTA, that potentially Mexico could face some financial difficulties. How do you see the administrations working together to prevent that?
I do think that on the part of Mr. López Obrador team, there is a very clear understanding of the importance of keeping sound macroeconomic fundamentals. I do believe that, and I think that's important. The second point that I would make is that there's an expression that you don't buy trust, you rent trust, and markets are very itchy, and they're demanding. And therefore, we must continue, I think, Mexico should continue to be very careful about positioning itself as a place attractive to financial investment and foreign direct investment. We are an open economy, and we should continue in that regard. Uncertainty about NAFTA is there. I think that it will continue to be there at some level until there's a conclusion. Again, I'll emphasize that the very first reactions that we've seen from Mexico's government-elect, if I may use that expression, are positive. I think that the peso has reflected that lately, and that's good. And I do expect that the transition team will, as it has done over the past month, will be engaged with institutional investors. We should always be careful with that. We've had over the last decades, not very good experiences with some macroeconomic turndowns in Mexico. And let me close by saying something that I believe is very important, which is it took at least 3 decades for Mexico to build fairly good, stable, modern democratic institutions. So whoever wins, once it's confirmed, legally confirmed, but the new government, as it happens in any democracy, will have to operate in a systems of checks and balances within the different branches of government. And more importantly, I think that there's going to be a very demanding civil society in Mexico. Civil society in Mexico has strengthened, has taken a much more important role in defining policy throughout different realms. And I expect that will continue to be the case. And that is always healthy. And also we have, in my view, we have a very independent and free press that helps put authority in check. And that's and we can expect that will continue to be the case in Mexico. And that's always useful.
I seem to be bringing up problems here this morning, which is not really my normal disposition, but I know that a lot of people in the U.S., Mexico, and the region are sort of concerned with let's say, a general deterioration in the economic and security and stability outlook for a number of countries in Central America, going over to Venezuela, where we're seeing, economic problems, political violence in more than one country. Obviously, in the U.S., we feel a rising pressure of refugees fleeing chaotic conditions. Is this a concern for Mexico, and do you see a future for U.S. Mexican cooperation in working on these issues?
Well, I do. I think that it's time for our friends from Central America, especially the Northern Triangle countries, the United States and Mexico, to have a serious conversation about development and migration and the linkage between those two, about security and migration. And I emphasize serious because, not because we have not done anything. I think that just last year, for example, the U.S. co-convened with Mexico an important conference in Miami in June of last year to address these topics. But serious in the sense that we need to have an effort, hopefully by the regional, the whole region, that is permanent, systemic, staff, and that involves resources to address these issues. We cannot, I think, be satisfied, any one of the countries, in terms of what is going on how we manage the migration phenomenon. That's the truth. I don't think the United States can be satisfied. I don't think we can be satisfied. And I don't think our Central Americans can either be satisfied. It's a very complex issue. You need to address the root causes of migration, and that's not easy. We must do everything we can, Mexico, Central America, to make sure that immigration is not a forced decision, as it has happened in the vast majority of the cases. That's not the responsibility on the United States. That's on us, I think. We certainly welcome the support of the United States in that regard, and the measures that have been taken over the years to address prosperity and security in the region are welcome. I just think we should do enough. We have not done enough. I think it's appropriate to recognize that. I think that it is in the interest of the United States to work with Central America and Mexico in that regard. I've seen an openness, at least to address these issues on the part of President Trump administration. Just next week, there will be a meeting in Guatemala, a working meeting, and we expect to have a second conference either late in the summer or in the fall with the Central Americans, ourselves and the United States. And again, there's three important things to do. Work together to do everything we can so people are not forced out of their countries because of lack of opportunity or any other reason. The second thing is that we should think carefully about, there will continue to be movement of people because that's just a fact of, the century that we're living in. I think everybody wants for that movement to occur in a way that it's legal, safe, and orderly. Do we have sufficient avenues for that? Are we working enough among the countries and within the countries to make sure that that is happening? And then finally, we need to address very head-on human smuggling and trafficking, which is terrible. And it's happening. And if we do that, if we make a serious effort, I think that, again, it's a complex phenomena, but I think we have a fair chance of addressing it fairly quickly.
It does seem that with the U.S. moving fairly aggressively to try to close its border, its southern border, for some time, the migration to the U.S. has been a safety valve. Central American migration to Mexico is almost a pass-through phenomenon. If the U.S. border is significantly harder to get across, does this mean that Mexico now faces a greater issue with Central American migration, or do you think it would slow if the U.S. frontier were known to be closed?
Well, first of all, as we as public expresses, one of the very first elements of the sovereignty of any country is be able to determine its migration system and to determine who enter and how does it enter.
It sounds like something President Trump says. If you don't have borders, you're not a country.
Well, I do believe that borders are there for a good reason. It's just that, can we think about borders, in the context of the 20th century, and what does that imply? And I think that implies several things. Again, it's a legitimate concern, but border security and borders is a legitimate concern. And we've said that publicly, number one. Number two, Mexico does not condone or promote illegal immigration. We lose our best people. Mexico loses when our people are forced to leave. But having said that, if you look at the numbers, and I beg to differ, with all due respect, that there's a quote-unquote crisis on the border. We do face challenges, we do. But if you look at the numbers, in the year of 2000, border apprehensions in the southern border of the United States reached 1.6 million, out of which around 98% of them came from Mexico. According to CBP figures in 2017, and that might be relatively a typical year, but apprehensions in the southern border were 311,000, 45% of them Mexicans. So there's been a huge change.
That's right.
There were years, and the number of apprehensions was as 1.6 million. We're now to around, the last full year, around 300,000. There's been a change in the profile. More families, as it's obvious. Less solo males, and there's reasons for that. More asylum seekers than not. There's a change. But we have the possibility of address that in a way that it does not confront our countries politically, number one. Why have Mexicans, the numbers of Mexicans, reduced? In part, certainly the tariffs. There's no question about that. But also because, we like to think that we've done our homework over the last 20 years. In spite of huge social challenges that we may face, people are doing better in Mexico. And perhaps a little bit better. But if people have access to a home, if people have access to a mortgage and to have a car, if they have a little bit of better health insurance or health, they're going to be less inclined. And I think, trying to be objective, that Mexico has done its work. And the numbers would seem to reflect that. We must continue to work in that regard. And the other thing is, yes, borders imply security. We can work together to make sure that the region, knows who is entering, when are they entering, and we in fact do. We work very closely with the United States in that regard to monitor, flows of people that come into the region. A security strategy, it's only about identifying risks, assigning them a probability that they will materialize, and then using whatever resources you have available to reduce that probability. By and large, that's what we do with the United States. And we can do more, and we can work with our Central American friends. I think there's sufficient common ground in that respect.
A question from the audience that leads into our discussion, I think, concern about the drug cartels and wondering how policy might change vis-a-vis the narco-trafficking with a new administration, what the state of play is, how effective have we been at limiting the rise of these cartels?
Well, if you look at what most people think, I think it's clear that we have not been successful enough, and that's an understatement. Security, or rather insecurity, is something that gravitated very much in Mexico's election, and for the right reasons and understandable reasons. I can only think that, first of all, the last two administrations in Mexico have have confronted as best as possible organized crime. By many different metrics, we're not doing a good enough job, and that's it wouldn't be appropriate not to recognize that. I think I think number one, we need to take into account that this is an issue that takes a long time to address, and I think that experience in other areas of the world would point to the fact that it's not there are no silver bullets to address this. Number two, I think we need to do a better job And that's the sort of conversations that we have had with the United States. We need to focus more on disrupting the business model that simply going after the heads of the cartels. If you look at the number, when President Peña Nieto administration started, there were around 100, please don't quote me on the exact numbers, but there were 122 identified main targets. I think 108 of them, or a little bit more, are either behind bars or are now dead. According to that metric, there's been a rather first success on that, and yet that does not seem to be the case. What we need to do is disrupt the business model, because if you don't disrupt the business model and you have a market, as we do, and we don't consider the supply and demand of whether it's drugs, weapons, money, etc., we're not going to be successful. Last year we had 2 high-level dialogues on disrupting transnational or dismantling transnational organized crime. I think they were useful. I think that I do think that security cooperation between Mexico and the United States, it's very good, in spite of a difficult political moment, by all means. And we do that because it is our own best interest. Nobody can tackle transnational organized crime if it does not work with your neighbors and partners, and that's the truth. And I hope, that would be my opinion, that that cooperation continues. As I've said before also, if the perception in Mexico on the overall political environment in the relation continues to deteriorate, the next government, and any government, is going to be less inclined to cooperate. Not because they don't want to, or not because we don't want to, or not because we don't think it's important, because simply the political support for it is going to be far less. And I think that needs to be taken into account. In that sense, the relation is, we have to look at it comprehensively.
One of the audience members asked that, considering that, in a sense, both leaders of Mexico and the U.S. now are more nationalistic, at least in some of their rhetoric, does this mean that some of these problems, like the drug cartels and so on, may become harder to resolve?
I think that what happened in Mexico is pretty much what has been happening everywhere, and there's 2 main elements to it. First, there's a huge disappointment on traditional political parties everywhere and around the world, and secondly, there is a urge of disruption around the world. And change is good. I think people need to be careful when taking quick changes. But I don't think that, and you can very well label Mr. López Obrador as a nationalistic movement. But I don't think that is directly related to support with respect to security cooperation. But from what I've heard, the public expressions during the campaign and in the last few days, Mr. López Obrador has expressed an interest and willingness to have a relationship with the United States and with President Trump in particular that is respectful, hopefully functional, and that it and has taken a constructive approach in that regard, based from what I see, and that provides an opportunity.
So a better relationship, say, than with Germany.
Better relations
with Mexico than with Germany for the U.S.
Well, I thought you were talking about soccer.
And Mexico is certainly covering itself in glory. As maybe not everyone in the U.S. knows, there's Mexican prosperity is regionally, it's not, regions differ. And in general, northern Mexico has been doing somewhat better than the southern, more rural parts of Mexico, which is where the new president-elect has his political base and where he's from. How will it change in kind of the balance of governance and political power in Mexico, a little bit from north to south? Will that affect Mexican economic policy, external policy? How do you see that working?
Well, first of all, I think that his base is now pretty much everywhere. If you look at some of the past, he did pretty well. He ran a very good campaign, and He convinced people, and to my knowledge, he won, a majority of the votes in all but one or two states, and that's quite something, irrespective of what anybody else think. Mexico does have an important challenge in terms of its diversity, regional diversity. If you go, to the north, and abusing of a generalization, but north seems to be a little bit more industrial, better linked to the international markets than the south. And I think that's, to some extent true. You see areas like Querétaro, Guanajuato in the middle that are doing extremely well, whose growth rates are way above the national average. And you also see in the south some states or regions that are, lagging behind in terms of economic growth. President Peña Nieto, in my view, addressed that through a very specific initiative, the Zonas Económicas, which implied, legal reforms, and that, I won't get into the details, but it's a way to address those disparities by providing certain incentives and certain institutional properties in a way that we can. That's certainly needed. But I don't think that with respect, I don't know any polls, diversity of opinions with respect to either, globalization, trade, or the United States that would differ vastly. Now, if you live in, in cities closer to the north, let me use an example. There are 16 what we could label binational metropolitan areas from Matamoros, Brownsville to San Diego and Tijuana. If you see those regions, if you take the example of Tijuana and San Diego, they are very much interdependent. The perfect example, they in fact have a shared international airport where, between San Diego and Tijuana. And they are increasingly thinking about ways to compete. My point, I don't want to extend myself, my point is that for many people along the border, I think that the natural day-to-day interaction in terms of trade, in terms of tourism, and even family ties is just, it's just part of their way of living. And I think that, that is why sometimes the border or the border region, and I happened to spend some time there the past 7 years, sometimes they're a bit skeptical about both Mexico City and Washington because they say, well, you don't really understand what is going on at the border.
Mm-hmm. What do you hear, or how large an impact in Mexico has the humanitarian border issue loomed lately, with the family separations, and certainly had a lot of publicity here in the United States and a lot of broad-based concern about that. What are you hearing in Mexico?
Well, in Mexico, as in other places, there was a huge concern about, family separation, as it happened here in the United States. And even though that the numbers of Mexican nationals involved is quite small.
It's more Central American?
Much more Central America. Actually, the number of Mexican, and please, again, it changes from one day and another, but the number of cases was around the neighborhood of 25 for different reasons. But nevertheless, I think that's, it created a huge concern, and rightly so. Since then, there have been conversations with the department. The administration here has taken its own, stance on the matter and address it. Part of next week's meeting in Guatemala will continue to center on, number one, what is being done to make sure that those families are united, to address migration in a broader context, regional context. I think it's important to address the issue of asylum. And that's not an easy topic, but it is also true that the number of asylum requests have grown here in an important way. The same is happening in Mexico, albeit at a different level. And therefore, that's why I think, we should openly, and we need to have the same conversation between the United States, Mexico, and Central America about what is going on. And it's not going to be easy, but if we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves, I think, just managing this rather than addressing serious solutions, at least for a while. And that I don't think it's in the benefit of anybody.
When it comes to the relations of Mexican consular officials with U.S. authorities on immigration cases and humanitarian cases, do you find the cooperation is usually pretty good and professional, or is it more difficult?
Quite frankly, it varies from region to region and from time to time. One of the central objectives here for our consulates, 50 of them, is assure that Mexican nationals, irrespective of their status, are subject to due process and that their human rights are also observed. And again, that does not mean we condone illegality or that we promote illegality. That's not what we do, and certainly not as a government. But we just base our work in what is, in the sort of provisions that the U.S. legal system provides for anybody here. And we do work frequently with the administration on different fronts, even on the tough fronts as this one. There's no other way to solve them or address them beyond, having serious, frank, and many times difficult dialogues. But that's what we do. And I think we sometimes have very good experiences, sometimes not so good. But it's the basic bread and butter of what we do every day.
Okay. One final question, because we're coming to the end, and I know you've got some commitments. How would you characterize your relations with the Trump administration, not simply at a political level, but sort of operationally? Are you able to, when you have questions, are you able to get good, quick answers? Is the State Department and other government agencies that you work with, are communications good, or do you feel that the machinery of government isn't necessarily working that smoothly?
When I came here, and I was as part of my ratification process in the Senate, I mentioned something. I said to the effect that the U.S. Mexico relation was at a critical point. And sure enough, it made some news. And I was asked to confirm, and I said yes, we are at a critical moment. Understanding a critical moment, a point in time in which we can either have work and, in spite of differences, have a much more mature relationship and one that works for both sides. It's simply as simple as that. We want a relation that works. Or there can be a major setback in the relationship. The past year and a half have implied, I think we're in a better shape than a year and a half. I tend to think that I have contributed to that a little, along with the team at Mexico and here at the embassy. The truth is that I think that there are people on both sides trying to do the right thing and trying to come with the best possible solution to the differences that we do have. That's helpful. I think that many people in the United States have, for the first time, have had to go out of their way to talk about the importance of the relationship. I think from a critical point of view, Mexico, we had slept in our laurels somewhat. We do have an image problem here that needs to be addressed. It's important for us to be present, to work with governments at different levels, with Congress, with the business sector, with NGOs here, just simply to have a systematic presence on what the relationship is about and what it's not. But we're in a better shape. And I do think that we do have a chance still to construct a better relationship. The differences that we have, which are known and public, have not impeded us to have fluid communication with the administration. I'm very clear about that. And sometimes we're criticized because of that. You can have differences and have fluid communication. In fact, I would argue that if you don't have fluid communication, frank, open, continuously, it's much harder sometimes to solve the differences. So the differences are there, but we will continue to try to address them with clear limits as it happens here in the United States.
Great. I know we're all very grateful to the ambassador for his time and for a really illuminating presentation. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. I'll walk you out.